Imagine the sound of a heavy limestone slab scraping across the earth. It is a sound of finality, a grinding of rock against rock that signals the end of a life. Below, in the suffocating darkness of a subterranean pit, the air is thick with the scent of musk, dried blood, and the low, vibrating rumble of predators. You can hear their breath, heavy, rhythmic, and hungry. These are not just animals, they are the instruments of imperial execution, starved to ensure that any flesh entering their domain is consumed before it even hits the floor. And in the center of this darkness stands an old man. He does not scream, he does not beg, he simply waits. This is not just a story of survival, it is the ultimate confrontation between the power of an earthly empire and the sovereignty of a heavenly king. This is the story of Daniel in the lion's den, a moment that redefined the meaning of courage and changed the course of history forever. To understand how a man of such high standing ended up in a pit of death, we have to look at the world he inhabited. By this time, the Golden Empire of Babylon had fallen. The legendary walls that Nebuchadnezzar thought would stand forever had been breached. A new power had risen, the Medo-Persian Empire, led by King Darius. In this transition of power, most of the old guard was swept away, replaced by the conqueror's own men. But Daniel was different. He was a survivor. He had arrived in Babylon as a teenage captive, a prisoner of war from the fallen city of Jerusalem. Over the decades, he had served kings with such integrity and brilliance that even the new Persian rulers couldn't ignore him. Daniel was now an old man, likely in his 80s. His hair was silver, his face lined with the weight of decades spent in the highest corridors of power. Yet his mind was sharper than ever. King Darius recognized something in Daniel that he didn't see in his own countrymen, an excellent spirit. Darius didn't just want Daniel as an advisor, he planned to set him over the entire realm. Daniel was to be the right hand of the king, the man who would oversee the vast bureaucracy of the Persian Empire. But in the world of ancient politics, brilliance breeds bitterness, and excellence invites enemies. The other high officials and satraps, the regional governors of the empire, watched Daniel's rise with a burning jealousy. To them, Daniel was an outsider, a relic of a conquered nation who had no business ruling over them. They began to watch him like hawks, looking for any slip-up, any hint of corruption, any financial irregularity they could use to bring him down. They scoured his records and followed his movements, but the more they looked, the more frustrated they became. Daniel was untouchable. He didn't take bribes. He didn't favor his friends. He was completely faithful to his duties. His life was a mirror of integrity that reflected their own shadows back at them. Realizing they could never find a flaw in his professional life, they turned their gaze toward his private life, specifically his faith. They knew that Daniel's primary loyalty wasn't to the crown of Persia, but to the God of Israel. They understood that if they could create a conflict between the law of the land and the law of his God, they would finally have him. It was a calculated, cold-blooded trap. They approached King Darius with a proposal that appealed directly to his vanity. They suggested a royal decree. For the next 30 days, no one in the entire empire could pray to any god or any man except to the king himself. Anyone caught violating this law would be thrown into the den of lions. Darius, perhaps swept up in the flattery and the idea of solidifying his divine authority over his new subjects, signed the decree. In the legal system of the Medes and Persians, once a king signed a law, it became irrevocable. It was written in stone, unchangeable even by the king himself. The trap was set. The hunters retreated into the shadows, waiting for their prey to make his move. Daniel heard about the decree. He knew exactly what it meant. He knew the men who had orchestrated it, and he knew the penalty for defiance. He could have easily justified a compromise, He could have prayed in secret, behind closed doors, or simply paused his public devotion for a mere 30 days. After all, God knows the heart, right? But for Daniel, faith was not a private convenience. It was a public testimony. He walked to his house, went to his upstairs room, and opened his windows toward Jerusalem. Just as he had done 3 times a day for his entire life, he knelt and prayed.
Oh Lord, hear my prayer.
He didn't lower his voice. He didn't pull the curtains. He gave thanks to his God, knowing that every word he spoke was a death warrant. The conspirators didn't have to wait long. They crowded around his house, peering through the windows, catching the old man in the very act of devotion. They hurried back to the palace, their faces lit with a sinister triumph. They reminded the king of his own decree, forcing him to acknowledge the unchangeable nature of the law. Then they dropped the name, Daniel. The man the king loved, the man he trusted above all others, had broken the law. The Bible tells us that when Darius heard this, he was deeply distressed. He realized too late that he had been played. He spent the entire day trying to find a legal loophole, a way to rescue his friend from the sentence he himself had signed. But the satraps were relentless. They hemmed him in with his own words. By sunset, the king was defeated. He gave the order. Daniel was arrested and brought to the mouth of the den. As the guards led Daniel toward the pit, the atmosphere was heavy with grief and malice. The king spoke to Daniel, perhaps with a trembling voice, saying, "May your God, whom you serve continually, rescue you." It was a statement born more of desperation than of certain faith. Daniel was lowered into the darkness. The lions growled, their eyes glowing in the faint light from above. Then the great stone was rolled over the opening. To ensure no one could interfere, the king pressed his signet ring into the wet clay on the seal, along with the rings of his nobles. Daniel was buried alive with the beasts. That night was one of the most contrasting nights in history. In the royal palace, the king of the greatest empire on earth could not sleep. He refused food. He refused the company of his musicians. He tossed and turned in his silk sheets, haunted by the image of the old man in the dark. But in the den, amidst the predators, there was a peace that surpassed understanding. We can only imagine the scene. The lions, usually driven by a primal urge to kill, suddenly becoming as docile as house cats. A light, not of this world, filling the damp cavern. An angel sent from the throne of God stood beside Daniel, shutting the mouths of the lions. While the king suffered in his palace, the prisoner rested in the den. At the first light of dawn, Darius rushed to the den. He didn't wait for his retinue. He ran to the stone and cried out in a voice filled with anguish, "Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to rescue you from the lions?" He waited in the silence, perhaps expecting only the sound of the wind or the low growl of the beasts. But then a voice drifted up from the depths, calm, steady, and respectful. "O King, live forever. My God sent his angel, and he shut the mouths of the lions. They have not hurt me, because I was found innocent in his sight." The relief that washed over Darius must have been overwhelming. He ordered Daniel to be lifted out of the pit immediately. When Daniel emerged into the morning light, the crowds were stunned. There wasn't a scratch on him, not a tear in his robe, not a drop of blood. He stood before the king as a living testament to a power that dwarfed the Persian throne. The Bible notes a crucial detail. No wound was found on him because he had trusted in his God. But the story doesn't end with a rescue. It ends with justice. Darius, now emboldened and furious at the deception of his advisors, ordered that the men who had falsely accused Daniel be thrown into the same den. In a grim display of the very fate they had intended for Daniel, they and their families were cast into the pit. The text tells us that before they even reached the floor, the lions overpowered them. The protection that had been granted to Daniel was a specific act of divine intervention, not a change in the nature of the lions themselves. King Darius then issued a new decree, one that went out to every corner of his vast empire. He commanded that everyone should fear and reverence the God of Daniel. He wrote, "For he is the living God, and he endures forever. His kingdom will not be destroyed, his dominion will never end." Think about the magnitude of that moment. A pagan emperor, the ruler of the known world, was preaching the sovereignty of the God of Israel because of the faithfulness of one man. Daniel's story is often told as a children's tale, but its themes are deeply sophisticated and relevant for every generation. It challenges us to consider where our ultimate loyalty lies. Daniel lived in a culture that was not his own. He served a government that did not share his values. Yet he didn't retreat from society, nor did he compromise his identity. He worked with excellence, he served with integrity, and when the world demanded he choose between his career and his Creator, he chose God without hesitation. He shows us that true courage isn't the absence of fear, but the presence of faith. Can you imagine the walk to that den? The smell of the lions, the sound of the stone closing. Daniel felt the weight of his mortality, yet he stood firm. His life reminds us that God does not always prevent the trials, but he is always present within them. Sometimes God calms the storm. Other times, he lets the storm rage and calms his child. In the den, he didn't remove the lions, he simply rendered them powerless. There is also a profound prophetic shadow in this story. Centuries later, another man would be condemned by a ruler who wanted to save him but felt trapped by the law. Another man would be placed in a tomb, sealed with a heavy stone and guarded by the authorities. But just as the stone was rolled away for Daniel to reveal a life that death could not touch, the stone was rolled away from the tomb of Jesus to reveal a victory over death itself. Daniel in the lion's den is a precursor to the resurrection, a sign that the living God has the final word over the grave. Daniel continued to prosper during the reign of Darius and into the reign of Cyrus the Persian. He lived to see the beginning of the return of his people to Jerusalem, the very city he had prayed toward 3 times a day. He proved that a single life, lived with unswerving devotion, can influence the hearts of kings and the destiny of nations. As we look back on this cinematic moment in history, we are left with a question. In our own lives, when the satraps of modern culture demand our compromise, when the decrees of the world challenge our convictions, and when we find ourselves in the dens of fear or opposition, where will we turn? Will we close our windows and hide, or will we kneel in the light of our faith? The story of Daniel is a call to excellence and a call to endurance. It tells us that integrity is the best defense and that faith is the greatest shield. It reminds us that no matter how dark the pit or how loud the lions roar, there is a king whose kingdom will never be destroyed. Daniel stepped out of that den not just as a survivor, but as a beacon, and his light still shines today, reminding us that the God who shut the mouths of lions is the same God who walks with us through our darkest nights. The silence of the den was broken by a miracle, and the decree of a king was eclipsed by the word of God. Daniel's legacy is not just that he lived through the night, but that he lived for the truth. And in the end, that is the only thing that truly lasts. The Persian Empire is gone. The lions of Babylon are dust. But the story of the man who wouldn't stop praying continues to inspire millions, proving that one person with God is always a majority. So, let the image of Daniel standing peacefully among the beasts stay with you. Let it be a reminder that your circumstances do not define your safety. Your shepherd does. Whether in the palace or in the pit, the presence of the living God is the only constant we truly need. And like Daniel, may we be found with an excellent spirit, faithful to the end, trusting in the one who holds the keys to every den and the power over every king. This is the enduring power of faith. This is the victory of Daniel. This is the dynamics of the living God. If you liked the video, please like and subscribe for more.